first time I saw him, I was 4 months into the job, still fresh enough that the company shrink had to sign off on my return to the cab. I'd slammed the emergency brake so hard I wrenched my shoulder. The train shrieked, lurched, threw standing passengers into poles and laps, and when the metal stopped screaming, I was already on the radio, voice cracking, reporting a jumper at Milepost 7.2, eastbound just before the S-curve by the old freight spur. Transit police walked the track bed with high beams and cadaver dogs for 3 hours. They found a flattened soda can, a dead raccoon, and a scattering of ballast that looked exactly like every other stretch of ballast between Avondale and Lansdowne. Nothing else. No body, no blood, no fabric. The camera feed from the lead car showed a smear of motion, something pale and upright crossing the beam right before I hit the brake, but the resolution was garbage, and the night shift supervisor said it was probably a plastic bag blowing across the tracks. I believed them for 48 hours. Then my next shift arrived, same timetable, same approach into the curve, and I saw him again. He came from the left, from a patch of scrub oak and sumac that crowded the right-of-way. A man in a long grey overcoat, dark trousers, something shiny in one hand, a briefcase handle, I thought. He didn't run. He didn't stumble. He stepped off the embankment with the deliberate, unhurried motion of someone descending a staircase, placed both feet between the rails, and looked up at my headlamp just as the train swallowed the space where he stood. My hand hovered over the brake. I didn't pull it. I blinked and the track was empty, the headlamp washing across rusted steel and gravel, and I coasted through the curve at regulation speed, heart punching my sternum, while behind me 100 commuters read their phones and never noticed a thing. That second time I didn't report it. I told myself I'd hallucinated, stress, sleep deprivation, the power of suggestion from the first incident. I bought blackout curtains and melatonin and a white noise machine shaped like a plastic mushroom. I stopped drinking after shifts. And on my next run, a wet Tuesday in November, I saw the man in the overcoat step down onto the tracks exactly where he had before, one hand swinging a worn leather briefcase, his chin lifted as though he were checking for rain. I didn't brake, I didn't flinch. I watched his face appear in the headlamp glow, a man in his early 50s, receding hairline, a thin mouth set in an expression I couldn't read, and I drove through him, or around him, or over him, and the train didn't shudder, and the air didn't scream, and when I checked my mirror, the rails behind me were clean and dark. That was the beginning of my understanding, though understanding isn't the right word, more like a slow, cold accommodation. The man on the tracks was a fixture of the line now, as permanent as the signal gantry at Milepost 7. I saw him every shift without exception. Eastbound, westbound, morning, night, rain, fog, the thin honey light of a summer evening, he was there. The same man, the same overcoat, the same briefcase, the same quiet step. He always faced the train, never flinched, never raised a hand to shield his eyes from the glare. Some nights he looked tired, some mornings he looked almost peaceful. I began to read his face the way you read the face of a passenger you see every day but never speak to. There was a scar above his left eyebrow, a pale line like a seam, a wedding band on his left hand, catching the light a half second before he vanished. The briefcase had brass fittings, tarnished, one clasp unfastened. Inside I glimpsed the edges of papers, manila folders, something that might have been a packed lunch in wax paper. None of it scattered when he jumped. None of it ever hit the gravel. After the 5th or 6th sighting, I started looking for answers. Not because I thought I was losing my mind, I'd passed through that fear and come out the other side, settled into a strange acceptance, but because I wanted to know who he was and why he was stuck on my stretch of track. Transit keeps meticulous records. I pulled the internal incident database on a terminal in the crew lounge, searched for fatalities, injuries, near misses at Milepost 7.2. Nothing. The last fatality on the line was 11 years ago, a teenager with headphones who stepped in front of a train 3 miles west. No jumpers, no suicides, no unidentified remains. I widened the search. Newspaper archives, library microfilm, obituary pages. I spent my days off scrolling through missing persons databases, clicking through photographs of vanished men in the right age range, looking for a grey overcoat, a thin mouth, a scar above the left brow. Nothing matched. I called the transit police sergeant who'd handled my first report, a patient woman named Okonkwo, and asked if there'd ever been a body recovered near the S-curve. She said no, and then she asked, gently, if I was still seeing things. I said no and hung up. My colleagues noticed. I'd become quiet in the break room, distracted during briefings. A senior engineer named Ruddy told me about a driver on the Blue Line who'd started seeing shadow people after 30 years on the job. He retired early and now sells handmade birdhouses in Vermont. Ruddy meant it as a cautionary tale, but I only heard the part about shadow people and felt a hot spike of recognition. The man on the tracks wasn't a shadow. He was detailed, specific, solid right up until the moment he was. He existed. He had existed, I was certain. Weeks passed, or months. The seasons turned. The man in the overcoat appeared right on schedule, and I began to dread the curve for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. It was the helplessness. Every time I saw him step down, every time I drove through his image, I felt like I was ignoring a cry for help that I couldn't quite hear. He wasn't asking me to stop. He wasn't looking at me at all. His eyes were fixed on something far beyond the headlamp, something in the past or the future, and I was just the machine that obliterated him again and again. I started talking to him, under my breath at first, then aloud. A one-sided conversation carried over the rumble of the wheels. "I see you," I'd say. "I know you're there. Who are you?" The figure never responded, never acknowledged me. But one night, as I entered the curve with the wipers ticking against a cold drizzle, I could have sworn his head turned a few degrees, as though he'd heard a distant sound. The movement was slight, a tilt, a shift of the jaw, and then the train passed through him and he was gone. I replayed it in my mind for the rest of the shift, unsure if I'd imagined it, terrified that I hadn't. By this point, I had memorized every detail of his appearance. I could have described him to a police sketch artist with clinical precision. The scar, 3 centimeters diagonal, slightly puckered at the lower end. The ring, plain gold, a little loose on the finger, the way a ring fits after weight loss. The coat, wool, charcoal grey, missing the second button. The briefcase, brown leather, a water stain on the bottom corner shaped vaguely like Florida. I knew this man the way you know a character in a book you've read 100 times, and yet I couldn't find him anywhere in the world of records and reports and public data. It was as though he had been erased from everything except the loop I witnessed. Then on the first Sunday in March, I had a day off and no plans and a restlessness that wouldn't let me stay indoors. I pulled on a jacket, caught a bus to Lansdowne Station, and walked east along the access road that paralleled the tracks. The morning was cold and bright, the sky a flat white, the weeds along the fence brittle with frost. I walked for 20 minutes until I reached the S-curve, the spot where the scrub oak thicket pressed close to the embankment and the rails curved gently north toward the river. In daylight it looked unremarkable. The ballast was grey and packed, the ties creosote black, the signal lights dark. I climbed the chain-link fence. It was old and sagging, easy to scale, and dropped onto the shoulder of the track bed. The gravel crunched under my boots. I stood where the man would have stood, facing the way a westbound train would come, and tried to see the world through his eyes. The view was ugly and industrial. A retaining wall tagged with graffiti, a billboard for a personal injury lawyer, a dead pigeon wedged in the drainage culvert. Nothing here worth dying for. Nothing worth returning to night after night in an endless reenactment of a final moment. I walked the track bed slowly, scanning the ground. I don't know what I expected to find. Maybe a piece of the briefcase, a scrap of fabric caught in the ties, something physical that would prove I wasn't losing my grip. The gravel was deep and loose in places, and I kicked through it half-heartedly, feeling foolish. A freight train horn sounded in the distance, not on this line, but the neighboring freight spur, and I froze out of instinct, then relaxed. I was alone. The commuter trains didn't run on Sundays until noon. Between the rails, near the exact point where the man's feet always landed, I noticed a pale shape half buried in the ballast. At first I thought it was a stone, a chip of quartz or concrete, but the shape was wrong. Too symmetrical, too smooth. I crouched down, the gravel digging into my knees, and brushed the dirt away with my fingers. It was bone, small, delicate, barely 2 inches long. A finger bone, I thought, though I'm no anatomist. A phalanx, maybe the proximal one from a left hand, judging by the subtle curve. The surface was stained brownish-grey from years of rain and diesel soot and pulverized brake dust, but the shape was unmistakable. No flesh, no tissue, just clean bone, worn smooth in places as though it had been tumbled by the vibration of 1,000 passing trains. I stared at it for a long time. The sun climbed higher, burning off the frost and a crow cawed from the sumac thicket. I didn't touch the bone at first. I didn't want to disturb it. But then I thought about the trains starting again tomorrow, about the vibration and the wheels and the endless grinding pressure, and I realized that if I left it here it might finally shatter, and whatever fragile tether kept the man anchored to this spot might snap forever. I picked it up. It was cold, colder than the air, colder than the gravel, as though it had been soaking in a deeper chill for years. I cupped it in my palm and felt a wave of vertigo pass through me, not nausea exactly, but a sense of dislocation, a brief and vivid impression of falling. I closed my eyes and saw the overcoat, the briefcase, the gold ring, the scar. I saw the man's face in a flash of headlamp light, and this time his expression wasn't blank. it was frightened. Genuinely, desperately frightened, the way a man looks when he realizes a mistake can't be undone. The feeling passed, I opened my eyes. The track bed was empty, the bone resting in my hand like a twig. I wrapped it carefully in a clean handkerchief from my pocket and climbed back over the fence, my heart hammering a rhythm I couldn't name. I called Mark Hennessy, a detective with the city police and one of the few people I still trusted from my old life before the trains. We'd grown up on the same block, drifted apart as adults, but he'd never been the type to mock someone's troubles. I told him I'd found human remains on the transit right-of-way and needed him to come take a look. No, I didn't want to call it in through the regular channels. Yes, I knew how that sounded. Please, Mark. He met me at a diner near the yard, looking tired and over-caffeinated, his tie loosened. I showed him the handkerchief on the formica table, unfolded it carefully. He looked at the bone, looked at me, looked at the bone again. "You're sure this isn't an animal?" he asked. "I'm not sure of anything," I said, "but I found it exactly where I keep seeing him. The man I told you about last year, the jumper." Mark remembered. I'd mentioned the sightings to him once, late at night after too much whiskey, and he'd listened without offering a diagnosis. Now he studied the bone with a new focus. He pulled out a pen, used it to turn the bone over without touching it. "Proximal phalanx," he said quietly. "Human, I'd bet, adult, left hand." He bagged it in an evidence pouch he happened to have in his coat, which told me he was taking me seriously. 2 days later, a small team of detectives and forensic techs swept the track bed around Milepost 7.2. They shut down the line for 6 hours on a Wednesday, which earned me a lot of dirty looks from dispatch. They combed the gravel with screens and rakes and a ground-penetrating radar unit that beeped and whined and found a lot of buried scrap metal and no other bones. No skull, no ribs, no vertebrae, no teeth. The investigators conferred in low voices, photographed the drainage culvert, took soil samples and left. Mark called me that evening and said, "They're going to run DNA on the bone, but don't get your hopes up. If it's been out there as long as it looks, the material might be too degraded." I asked him what "as long as it looks" meant. He paused. "Years," he said, "maybe more." I went back to work. The trains ran, the passengers boarded and disembarked, the signals cycled from red to green. And every shift, without fail, the man in the grey overcoat stepped down onto the tracks and let me drive through him. I watched him more closely now. I searched his face for clues, for some sign that the discovery of the bone had changed something. His expression remained the same, resigned, distant, occasionally touched with that flicker of fear I'd glimpsed in my moment of vertigo. But his hand, his left hand, the one that held the briefcase, I started looking at it with more attention. The ring was there, the loose gold band, but now I could see what I'd missed before or what I'd refused to register. The little finger was missing. Not severed cleanly, not a stump, just absent, the space below the knuckle smooth and dark, as though the finger had never existed. I'd been seeing the bone, or the absence of the bone, every night without letting myself understand it. 3 weeks after the search, Mark called me and asked if I could meet him at the precinct. His voice was strange, tight, careful, the voice of a man delivering news he hasn't fully processed himself. I drove down on my lunch break and found him in a conference room with a thin folder and a cup of cold coffee. "They got a DNA match," he said, sitting down across from me. "The bone, the lab managed to extract a usable sample. It's degraded, but the markers were clear enough for a partial profile." I waited, my hands were flat on the tabletop, and I could feel my pulse in my fingertips. "The profile matches a missing person from 3.5 years ago," Mark said. "A man named Arthur Lyle, 54 years old, married, no kids, worked as a claims adjuster for an insurance firm downtown. According to the file, he left for work one morning in October and never arrived. His wife reported him missing that evening. They found his car in the long-term parking garage at Avondale Station. That's the one just before your curve, isn't it?" "Yes," I said, my voice sounded far away. There was no sign of him in the station, no activity on his credit cards, no note, no history of mental health issues that the wife disclosed. The investigation went cold. They never found a body. Mark opened the folder and slid a photograph across the table. "Take a look. Is this the man you've been seeing?" I looked at the photograph. It was a driver's license photo, the kind where the subject looked slightly startled by the flash. A man in his early 50s, receding hairline, thin mouth, a pale scar above the left eyebrow. I had never seen this photograph before in my life, and I knew every line of that face better than I knew my own. The same brow, the same jaw, the same faint asymmetry of the nostrils. He was wearing a collared shirt in the photo, no overcoat, but I could imagine the overcoat draped over his shoulders as easily as if I were looking at a painting I'd memorized. "That's him," I said. "That's the man I see." Mark nodded slowly. He didn't ask if I was sure. He closed the folder and rubbed his eyes with the heels of his hands, a gesture of exhaustion I'd seen 100 times in the break room after a bad shift. "The working theory," he said, "is that Arthur Lyle walked from the parking garage to the track bed somehow, maybe through a gap in the fence, maybe along the access road, and stepped in front of a train. No one reported a collision. No one saw it happen. The trains run frequently through that curve, and if a body went under the wheels at speed, he trailed off. It would be scattered," I finished, "pulverized, dragged for a mile before anyone noticed. Biological material would be degraded by weather, scavengers, the vibration of the trains. You'd be left with fragments, maybe nothing at all, except a single finger bone wedged deep in the ballast, protected by the rails." He looked at me. "You found it because you knew where to look." I didn't correct him. I hadn't known. I'd guessed or been guided or simply stumbled into the right patch of gravel because I couldn't stop myself from searching. It didn't matter. What mattered was the photograph on the table, the name, the scar, the ring. Arthur Lyle, missing for 3.5 years, never found, never mourned with a body, never buried, just gone, leaving behind a wife who probably still woke up every morning hoping for a knock on the door and an explanation that never came. Mark said something about a follow-up investigation, about notifying the wife, about the possibility of finally closing the case. I nodded at the appropriate moments and excused myself before my lunch break ran out. I walked back to the yard in a daze, the photograph burned into my retinas, and climbed into the cab of my assigned train for the afternoon run. The shift was uneventful. The sun slanted through the windshield as I pulled out of the terminal, passengers murmuring behind the locked cab door, the familiar weight of the throttle under my hand. I ran the route on autopilot, my mind elsewhere, until the signal lights at the approach to Milepost 7.2 flickered from green to yellow, and I braked slightly for the curve. The sumac thicket emerged from the twilight, the retaining wall, the graffiti, the dead pigeon still wedged in the culvert. And Arthur Lyle stepped down from the embankment, grey overcoat swinging, briefcase in his right hand, the space where his left little finger should have been as smooth and dark as a hole in the world. He turned his face toward the headlamp, the same face from the driver's license, the same thin mouth, the same scar, and for one suspended moment our eyes met. I'd been wrong all those months, thinking he never looked at me. He had been looking past me, through me, at the train and the light and the noise that had ended him. But tonight, as the wheels sang on the curve and the cab shuddered around me, Arthur Lyle's gaze shifted. It focused. It landed on my face behind the glass, and his expression changed. It wasn't fear this time. It wasn't peace. It was recognition. The train passed through him, and the track ahead was empty, the signal gantry blinking its steady yellow. I finished the route, docked the train, signed my logbook with a hand that didn't tremble. In the crew room, someone had left a newspaper on the bench. I saw the headline without meaning to. Remains found on transit line identified as missing city man, 54. There was a photograph next to the text, the same driver's license photo I'd seen on Mark's table. Arthur Lyle stared out at me from the front page. A man returned to the world in the smallest possible piece, his anonymity finally broken. I folded the newspaper and tucked it under my arm. Outside, the yard lights were coming on, the trains settling into their berths for the night. I thought about Arthur's wife, who would soon get a call from a detective, who would learn that her husband had been lying in pieces on a commuter line while she waited 3.5 years for an answer. I thought about the bone in the evidence locker, the only part of him that hadn't been scattered to dust. I thought about the man himself, stepping down onto the rails in an eternal October morning, dressed for work, carrying his briefcase, a gold ring loose on his finger. And I understood, finally, what I had been witnessing. Not a suicide replayed in endless loop, not a ghost crying out for justice. A fragment, a remnant, a single finger bone's worth of memory, trapped in the ballast by pressure and time, broadcasting the same final moment over and over into the fabric of the curve. The man wasn't whole. He was a splinter of consciousness, a recording with no off switch, a photograph taken in the instant before oblivion and played on repeat for an audience of one. I was the only person who ever saw it. The only person who ever would. The trains would keep running, the passengers would keep scrolling their phones, and Arthur Lyle would keep stepping off the embankment into the headlamp's glare, forever and ever, until the tracks rusted away and the sumac took back the right-of-way. Tomorrow night I'll be back in the cab, eastbound, approaching the S-curve. He'll be there, he's always there, but now I know his name, now I know his face. And when the light catches the scar above his eye and his mouth begins to shape a word I can't hear, I'll nod to him. I'll hold the throttle steady. I'll drive through him without flinching because that's my job, and because somewhere in the space between the rails, a small cold piece of Arthur Lyle is waiting for a burial that might finally let him rest. Or maybe it won't. Maybe he'll be on that curve for as long as I'm on this line, a companion in the dark, a silent passenger whose ticket was punched long before I ever climbed aboard. Either way, I'll see him every shift. I'll never stop seeing him. And the strangest part, the part I can't explain, the part that keeps me awake on Sunday mornings when the trains don't run, is that I'm no longer sure I want to.